Hello, John.
All right. Welcome back after a very exciting morning. So here we are. We're going to find out, take our next plunge into this quite amazing topic. And I think it's going to be a very interesting one because it's going to be coming from Evan Thompson, who rarely disappoints.
Gee, thanks, John. What a setup.
Evan, Evan and I have known each other quite a long time. We actually overlapped, I think, at Amherst, but didn't actually know each other. Or did we overlap? I'm not sure, but we both studied with Bob Thurman way back when. But of course, then Evan went on to get his PhD at the University of Toronto, and he taught in Toronto for several years, and then is now professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia, author of some very important books for our purposes, including, of course, the Embodied Mind, but also Mind in Life, which I think of as the commentary to the embodied mind in some ways. And also, of course, The Blind Spot, which we've been talking about, a very important work that will probably come up in Evan's talk and also, of course, in Adam, his co-author's talk. Evan's also the author of Why I Am Not a Buddhist, which I read as a pun. I will explain later. But all joking aside, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Evan has to say. So, Evan, take it away.
All right, so I'm going to try to share my screen here. Always a bit of a trick. Let me just see if I can get this right. Okay, do people see my screen? Yes, okay, good. All right, I can't see any of you now, so if something goes wrong, somebody will have to just let me know. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk with you about life and sentience and intelligence today. And the things that I'm going to be saying are very much going to build on the talks that we had this morning by Molly and Luke. So I want to begin with a thought experiment, which is how we begin the chapter 6 on life in the book The Blind Spot. And the thought experiment goes like this. Imagine an advanced AI system. We're given all the laws of mechanics, all the equations for electromagnetism, and all tables for all possible chemical reaction chains. Physics and chemistry would exhaust its cognitive ontology, that is, its model of the world. The question is, would it ever stumble on and be able to recognize living systems with that kind of cognitive ontology? How would it be able to tell that the heart's function is to pump blood and not to make sounds? From a physicochemical point of view, there's really no difference except in that the heart has a certain collection of effects. Among them, one is pumping blood, and then among them is making sounds. So how would you be able to individuate biological functions from just a physicochemical point of view? How would it be able to tell the difference between a healthy process and a pathological one? Healthy and pathological are not physical categories in the sense of categories we find in physics or in chemistry. They're biological categories. Normative ones, of course. In short, how would our AI system, being confined to a physicochemical representation of the world and lacking the concept of a living being, to say nothing of the experience of being alive, be able to bring organisms into focus, let alone distinguish within them between function and side effect or health and disease? So we use this thought experiment to make the point that, to quote the philosopher Hans Jonas, it takes life to know life. Without the experience of embodiment and the sui generis, the unique concept of life, there's no way to discern what demarcates an organism as a persisting being or a persisting individual or a persisting pattern in the constant turnover of molecules, atoms, and elementary particles, which is all that we have from a physical-chemical point of view. Biology, that is to say the science of life, then presupposes as a necessary precondition life's experience of itself. So it takes life to know life, and it takes life for there to be a science of life. The science of life depends on life's experience of itself. So this sets the context for what I want to talk about today, that when we're thinking about life, we're engaged in a reflexive investigation that has to include ourselves as living beings, both as objects and as subjects, and the inescapability of really pinning us down to being either objects or subjects, which is really just to say that from that kind of circularity, we escape or we lie beyond the subject-object dichotomy. Okay, so specifically, I want to talk about 3 topics, and I'm going to spend most of my time on the first one, what is life? And then I'm going to raise some questions about life and sentience, and then I'm going to end with a few remarks about AI. Life in the largest sense is the web of life as we know it from the natural history of life on Earth. Today, and this is largely due to work by Lynn Margulis, who's pictured there on symbiosis and cell evolution, we think of life not so much as a tree, but as a web, because the branches, as it were, entwine with each other through symbiosis and the symbiotic formation of new organisms and new pathways in the development or in the natural history, the phylogeny of life. And we think of this in biology as made up of various so-called kingdoms, probably not the best word. The eubacteria, the archaea bacteria, protists, plants, animals, and fungi. And the bacteria are the oldest and structurally the simplest prokaryotic cells. And then the protists, plants, animals, and fungi all depend on so-called modern cells, that is, more complex eukaryotic cells. And Lynn Margulis's work, Lynn Margulis was at Upaya, so this is another reason I wanted to foreground her here. She's a very good friend of my father's and good friend of mine as well, sort of a family member. She really amassed a huge amount of evidence for the importance of eukaryotic evolution, fundamentally depending on the symbiogenesis, the symbiotic fusion of different life forms going back to the oldest and earliest bacterial forms of life. So life is a web, a huge web, a planetary web. We could put all this in a summary form by saying life is reproductively and genetically linked populations of ecologically embedded active organisms existing on a planetary scale. So let's think about this statement in a little bit more detail. So we have the evolutionary historical dimension through reproduction and genetic linkage. We have the populational perspective. We're talking about populations of organisms. That's the subject of population genetics and population biology. Evolutionary theory is the theory that handles life from an evolutionary historical perspective. Then we have the ecological dimension of life. Life is ecologically embedded. This is the province of ecology and what today is called Earth system science, which had an important part of its origin in the Gaia theory developed by Lynn Margulis and James Lovelock. We talk about this in the last chapter of The Blind Spot. And then we have the perspective that I'm going to emphasize today, which is the individual level perspective, that is active organisms. This is the province of organismic biology, and topics of concern are biological organization. How must a system or an entity be organized so as to be a biological entity, in particular to be an organism? And the theory of biological autonomy, which I will also talk to you about today, that the idea that organisms are autonomous systems in a precise sense of autonomy that I will explain in a bit. Okay, so I'm focusing then on the individual perspective, the perspective of the organism. The word organism was actually introduced in the 18th century to mean the kind of organization exemplified by living beings contrasted to that of machines, machines in the sense of special purpose artifacts that we make, that we human beings have been making for millennia. And then in the 19th century, organism came to mean an individual living being. The question that arose very early in modern biology is, what kind of organization is required for an individual system to be an organism, to be a living being? How must a being be organized in order to be a living being? And this actually takes us, interestingly, to, of course, one of the major figures of modern philosophy, Immanuel Kant, who in his third of his three critiques, the Critique of the Power of Judgment, has a section on what he calls teleological judgment, in which he's concerned with living beings and with this idea of organization. And what Kant points out is, he says, well, if we look at an organism, if we look at a living being, he actually uses the term living being, we see that the parts depend on their relation to the whole. So in a multicellular organism, the many cells depend on their relation to the whole multicellular organism, or the enzymes in a cell depend on their relationship to the cell as a whole metabolic system. So there's a part-whole interdependence. And Kant says the parts produce each other reciprocally, so that they are reciprocally cause and effect of the form of the whole. And no machine is like this. Kant is the one who first introduces the word self-organizing. He says, in virtue of these two features, the living being is organized and is self-organizing, is, you could say, auto-organizing. The parts produce the whole, while the whole also, in a sense, produces the parts. Now, jumping forward several centuries, we have a line of research in biology that works from this Kantian idea and makes progressively more precise this idea of the distinctive kind of organization that makes up a living being. And one of the first notable works is by Jean Piaget, his work Biology and Knowledge, written originally in French, published, I believe, first in 1967. And Piaget introduces the mathematical concept of closure to describe biological organization. So it's important to understand here, closure does not mean being energetically or physically closed. It's an abstract notion that comes from mathematics, from logic, from algebra. And closure is when you have an operation like adding, which you perform on members of a set, such as real numbers. And when you do that, you always get as a product a member of the same set that then you can subject to that operation again. So the result of the operation stays in the same set. So this is a kind of abstract, formal idea, you could say. He takes that idea and he applies it in the context of systems biology. And he says that a process, say in a cell, like protein synthesis, produces elements, enzymes say, that make up and enable that process, both constitute and make possible that process, so that the process and elements are mutually dependent. They stay in the same set of processes. So the processes have closure. Again, closure here doesn't mean thermodynamically closed, it means organizationally having closure. So an organism has to be thermodynamically open to exchanges with the environment and organizationally closed in the sense of being made up of elements that have to keep a cyclic organization by regenerating themselves through chains, links of mutual dependence. So in our world, you cannot have organizational closure without thermodynamic openness. Now, Francisco Varela, working with Umberto Maturana in the 1970s, culminating in this book published in 1979, Principles of Biological Autonomy, takes this idea of closure from Piaget and makes it more precise. And I want to just pause for a moment and say that this book has been extremely difficult to get a hold of. It's been out of print for a long time. It is being reissued by MIT Press, probably in 2025, with a foreword by Amy Cohen Varela and with annotations by me and Ezekiel Di Paolo. And so there will be a new edition with our marginal annotations relating the work to more current developments. And MIT is going to also publish it open access, so you can just go to the MIT site and download it. This will be free of charge. This will be, I think, sometime in 2025. Okay, so what Francisco did is he introduced what he called organizational closure, the concept of organizational closure, and he used it to define autonomy, or to define an autonomous system, and to characterize biological autonomy. And here's a way of basically visualizing the idea. This is a figure from Ezekiel Di Paolo. The black circles stand for processes, and the arrows stand for enabling relations. So if one circle points to another, the circle that's being pointed to depends on the one that's pointing to it. So the ones that are highlighted in black, each one of them both depends on and enables another black circle. So they have closure in this organizational sense. But of course, they exist in a wider milieu of other processes, the ones in gray. That's the niche or the environment. But because they're organized in this reciprocally interdependent way, they form a kind of unity. So you could think of this as enzymes in a cell. You might, at another level, think of it as animals in a colony. You might think of it as nerve cells in a nerve net. There's different kinds of systems that this might apply to. But the basic idea is that when you have this kind of interdependence, you basically have what Kant was talking about, parts that are mutually enabling and mutually productive that create a whole that then is necessary for the continued maintenance of the parts. Because in an energetic material universe, these processes, the ones that are represented by the black circles, if they weren't interlocked with each other in this way, they would have a tendency to run down and to atrophy. So they are in a precarious situation, thermodynamically speaking. So that's the basic idea of closure that Francisco formalized, and he formalized it conceptually, and also he developed early mathematical models of this. More recent work, so this book was published in 2015 by Alvaro Moreno and Matteo Mosio, describe this in terms of constraint closure. So what's interesting about this is that if you look at, say, figure 1 constraint with A with an arrow to B, that's like the one black circle pointing to another black circle. It's the idea that you have a process of transformation in which, let's say, A produces B or A gives rise to B. C stands for a constraint under which this happens. So you might think of, say, the vascular system transporting blood or fluids. And so it constrains the processes of blood flow, but it also depends on the processes of blood flow. They're mutually interdependent. But the vascular system, let's say the veins and the arteries, that constraint functions at a different time scale, typically a slower time scale than say the faster process of the blood flow. Or you could think of it in terms of enzymes in a cell. So you have a constraint on which a process depends, but then you can iterate this. So this is number 2 in the figure, where that constraint is in turn dependent on a process, which may in turn depend on another constraint. And then if you move to figure 3, you can see that one way that this can be organized in terms of constraints and processes that are mutually enabling and dependent, existing at different time scales, and that realize closure in the abstract sense that we talked about. So the idea then is we started with this Kantian idea of organization, self-organization, and then we made it more and more precise, particularly with an eye to living systems in terms of Varela's notion of organizational closure, and now this idea of constraint closure. Francisco used the word autopoiesis to describe how this happens at a single cell level. So the idea is that you have a metabolic reaction network of proteins and enzymes and catalytic populations of molecules. They produce components that in part determine and constitute a boundary, a topological boundary. This is the membrane in the case of the single cell. And that membrane is necessary to house and to generate and regenerate the metabolic network that produces its own components that constitute the membrane and the network. So this is a kind of minimal biological case, autopoiesis, self-production, where we have closure, and as a result, we have an autonomous system, where autonomous means that it's self-producing and self-maintaining. In life on Earth, we know that this happens through the particular specific and stable relation of proteins and DNA and RNA, but we can imagine maybe earlier in the history of life that we had simpler forms of topologically closed reaction networks that eventually then came to house replicating molecules and to produce cells as we know them on Earth today. Now, these ideas of autopoiesis and closure give us a very precise way of distinguishing between different kinds of systems. So if we want to know whether something is autopoietic, we ask, well, is there an internal reaction network that's interdependently linked to a boundary? In the case of, say, a bacterium or amoeba, the answer to that is yes. In the case of a virus or a crystal, the answer is no. You may have a boundary, but you may not have an internal reaction network, or you may have a boundary and an internal reaction network, as you do, say, in the case of mitochondria, but you don't have them interdependently linked in the way that you do in a cell. So these concepts are precise in the sense that they enable us to pick out forms of organization and differentiate them one from another. All right. So we've been talking about organization, closure, self-production, autopoiesis, but that's not really enough for life as we know it, because living beings aren't just self-producing in this peculiar circular way under constraint closure. They also exhibit adaptivity. That is, they construct and regulate themselves in relation to conditions of viability, internal and environmental viability, conditions and constraints. Viability means zones within which they can live and flourish, you might say, and zones where if they approach the limit of their viability, then their existence is threatened. So adaptivity, being able to regulate oneself in relationship to monitoring and tracking zones of viability is fundamental to life, to the adaptivity and plasticity of life. And that implies a kind of agency, that is a way to self-modify interactive behavior so as to keep on going, so as to maintain viability. The concept of adaptivity formalized or made precise in the way that I've just been doing it comes from Ezequiel Di Paolo's work, and he describes it as an organizationally closed system's capacity to self-regulate in a way where tendencies to approach the system's viability boundary, beyond which it's no longer viable, are distinguished from tendencies to recede from the boundary, and tendencies to approach the boundary are transformed into tendencies to move away from the boundary. And this takes, you might say, ways of tracking, monitoring viability. So closure plus adaptivity give us agency. And it's important to understand here that agency is fundamentally then a relational phenomenon. Agency has to do with the relation between a system and the environment. It doesn't exist inside the system in some like executive control center sense. It has to do with a system being constituted by a network of processes that are self-sustaining, that are coupled to the environment, and that exert regulatory constraints on the way that coupling with the environment happens. That's what agency in this very minimal sense amounts to. So agency depends then on individuality. That is, we have a distinction that's being drawn between a system and its environment. And the system is a self-individuating one. It's not just something that we can pick out as an entity, but it's something that individuates itself through organizational closure and adaptivity. And in doing so, it enacts or brings forth its own niche, its own domain of relevance or significance, given the constraints of the world or the environment in which it finds itself. The interaction here, looked at from the perspective of the system, has a kind of asymmetry. That is, the system is the active source of interaction. So imagine a seagull or a bird gliding on the currents of the air. We have an interaction between the changing air currents and the seagull, but the seagull is surfing the air currents by constantly modulating itself in relationship to the air in a way in which the air is not modulating itself in relationship to the seagull. So that's what I mean by interactional asymmetry. Of course, this is relative to our perspective, how we're picking out systems and describing them and individuating them. And there can be different ways of doing that. But at least if we're interested in, say, seagulls surfing the air, then it's the seagull that surfs the air, not the air that surfs the seagull. And there's a normativity that's implicit in this, in the sense of the viability norm of the organism or the animal. The interaction depends on the organism maintaining itself in its zone of viability and monitoring, regulating its activity so as to be able to do this. Now, already we see this in some of the most basic biological forms of behavior. So as I said, bacteria are the oldest and structurally the simplest organisms that we know. Simple is really kind of not a good word to use because bacteria are already incredibly complex. They can distinguish upwards of 40 different kinds of molecular species, ones that they can metabolize like sucrose, and therefore that they will swim up gradient towards ones that are like heavy metals that are noxious and that they will swim away from. And the way that this works is that the bacteria will go into a tumbling mode where it randomly tumbles about and basically samples the molecular concentrations in the immediate environment. And then when it hits on an increase in the concentration of, say, sucrose, its flagella will organize into a kind of propeller and it will swim up the gradient, metabolizing sucrose as food, energizing itself, you could say, so as to maintain its viability. So this is what Francisco called a kind of sense making, because again, if we look at the physical chemical environment through as the AI system in our thought experiment did at the very beginning, we just have different species of molecules, disaccharides in the case of, say, sucrose, and there's nothing particularly special about that other than its structural form from a physical chemical point of view. There's nothing that stands out about it as food, nothing that stands out about it as something that has to do with viability. That stands out only when we have the perspective, as it were, of the living being, the bacterium, for which it is significant. So the way that I like to put this, building on Francisco's idea of living as sense-making, is to say that living is sense-making in precarious conditions. So closure and adaptivity and agency imply sense-making. Sense-making is always in precarious conditions, conditions that have to do with viability. And this is the biological root of mind, the biological root of cognition, and indeed the biological root of intelligence. And again, I will point out, and maybe some of you are biologists and are microbiologists and would know much more about this than I do, but bacteria are incredibly complex in their abilities to sense, in their abilities to have historically dependent behaviors individually and across reproductive generations. That's a kind of memory. So we already have very complicated sense-making activities at the very root of what we know as life on Earth. Umberto Maturana put the point this way. This is in his really foundational paper called The Biology of Cognition from 1970. He said, living systems are cognitive systems. Francisco would substitute the word sense-making here, because as a cognitive scientist, he he wanted to have a term larger than the way that cognitive scientists often use the word cognitive. So living systems are sense-making systems, and living as a process is a process of cognition, a process of sense-making. This statement is valid for all organisms with or without a nervous system. Now, I want to draw out some implications of this way of looking at things. The first is, obviously, the nervous system doesn't create sense-making. We could say, rather, that it expands sense-making. So this is a diagram of, or a map, you might say, of part of the nervous system of aplysia, sea slug. And the idea is that you have sensory neurons and motor neurons. They are what enable the organism to sense its environment and to move accordingly. A bacterium already senses its environment and moves. It senses through molecules embedded in its membrane and moves through its flagella. But in a multicellular organism, where the style of life is to move fast over large distances, you need to hold together. You have different cells that make you up. You need to hold together, and you need to be able to signal fast. And interneurons with fast electrochemical signaling enable the organism to hold together, to change its shape as it moves and darts about very, very quickly. So this is an enlargement of sense-making, but it's not a creation of sense-making in the sense that it's not that sense-making emerges first on the scene with nervous systems. Sense-making already exists at the cellular level, and the nervous system is a complexification of that. We can think of this in terms of a kind of formal resemblance or analogy. So the circle on the bottom right is the one I already showed you about autopoiesis. So we have a similar kind of circularity with the nervous system, where we have populations of neurons that exchange signals in a fast way, form temporary, transient populations of activity that enable sensory motor linkages, the sensory systems and the motor systems tied together in the animal. The sensory and motor systems, as the animal moves, modulate the intrinsic dynamics of the nervous system that gives rise to these transient ways of linking sensory and motor systems. So we have the same kind of, at a very abstract level of description, circularity that we see in the fundamental circularity of life at the autopoietic level. If we think of this now in terms of ecology, this is really what the word enaction was first introduced to capture, is the idea of sense-making through sensory motor coupling, where the nervous system in the body of the animal, as it moves, brings forth or enacts a niche that consists of affordances, what the opportunities for the animal are within its zone of viability. And this is a kind of environment-organism codependence and co-construction. It's really a kind of, using Buddhist language, it's a kind of dependent co-origination of the living being and its environment, where the environment isn't objectively out there pre-existing the organism, the environment in the sense of the niche, the world of that organism, the world and niche of the organism arises in and through the organism's action and behavior, while of course also shaping the organism's action and behavior. So it's a kind of codependent origination. All right, so that's implication one. Implication two is that organisms are not machines. With the rise of molecular biology in the 1950s, a dominant conceptual metaphor for thinking of organisms was to think of organisms at in terms of molecular machines. So a kind of change of focus from organismic biology to population genetics and molecular biology, where the dominant conceptual metaphor was the machine. This, of course, has produced important research, but it's a fundamentally limited and flawed metaphor. You can see that this would be how Kant would have illustrated the difference. A machine like a watch is made up of independently specifiable and prefabricated parts with highly precise interfaces so that they can fit together. A machine is fundamentally decomposable. You can take it apart, and modular. Each part has its own independently specifiable function. But that's not the case for processes that are interlinked in this organizationally closed way at different time scales with constraints and processes mutually enabling each other. Such systems are not decomposable. That is, they can't be taken apart into parts that have pre-existing functions, and then you assemble the functions to get the whole. These systems are so-called non-decomposable systems, unlike a watch. Now, more in relationship to our theme of AI, there is a very interesting question that arises where if we think of our contemporary concept of mechanism or a machine as something that really has to do with computation and with computable functions as specified in Alan Turing's abstract mathematical model of a Turing machine and a universal or programmable Turing machine, which is the underlying theory behind computers as we know them today. Again, we see in the concept of a Turing machine, we see the idea of a decomposable system, a system that consists of a head that can read and write symbols, that moves along a tape that's divided into squares. There's a very interesting question that's arisen in the literature, which is whether this kind of organizational closure that we see in living systems is computable in that precise mathematical sense. That is, we know we can use computation to simulate life, but a simulation and a realization or instantiation is not the same thing, because a simulation is always partial. You emphasize certain aspects of a system when you simulate it under some model or description. But whether this kind of self-referential closure is computable is an open question that's arisen in the literature. And if you're interested in following this through, because some theoretical biologists, most notably Robert Rosen, in his work in the 1970s and 1980s, argued in a rigorous mathematical way that this kind of closure, organizational closure, is actually not Turing computable. There's debate about this in the literature, but it raises the question of, well, we can't take for granted that life is computable. We can simulate life, but whether you could actually realize life in a computational way is a different kind of question. If that's not possible, then we have another fundamental difference between organisms and machines, where machine is defined precisely in computational terms. Okay, so we could summarize this by saying organisms are Kantian wholes. They are systems in which the whole and the part are interdependent. They're non-decomposable systems, whereas in machines, we have properties of the components that are independent of the whole and exist prior to it. That is, the system is decomposable. Organisms act on their own behalf. They are purposive agents. They're purposive due to closure and adaptivity, whereas machines operate according to externally determined functions. The functions don't have to do with what makes up the system organizationally with its closure of processes. The functions have to do with how things are specified from the outside the system. All right, third implication. And here I'm using the terminology of Stuart Kauffman. This is a marvelous little book I recommend to all of you, A World Beyond Physics. Stu Kauffman puts it by saying it's impossible to pre-state the phase space of biological evolution, meaning that life is essentially historical, that organisms and environments co-create each other. And what is meant by this is that the parameters and the boundary conditions of phylogeny, of evolutionary history, are constantly changing at all sorts of different spatiotemporal levels: molecular, morphological, behavior, and ecological. So I want to unpack what he means here by this impossibility of pre-stating the phase space of biological evolution. So phase space, what is that? This is something we spend a lot of time talking about in the blind spot. Phase space is an abstract space in which all possible states and trajectories of a system are represented. So this is an idea from mathematical physics, with each possible state corresponding to a unique point in the space. In classical mechanics, phase space would consist of all the possible values of position and momentum variables for a system, so that as the system evolves in time, it traces out a trajectory in phase space, and the shape of the trajectory reveals aspects of its dynamics, whether it's periodic, whether it's chaotic, and so on. Now, a phase space has to be constructed in advance of calculating the trajectories in it. So think of the classical billiard ball model. We specify the boundary conditions, so that's the surface of the table. We specify the initial conditions, that's the starting positions of the balls. And then we can calculate or compute, at least in principle, the positions, all the possible positions and momenta of the balls on the surface of the table. But now think about evolution. The phase space of evolution is constantly changing. And this is why Kaufman says it can't be pre-stated. So imagine the surface of the billiard table constantly changing its shape, constantly undergoing deformation, including adding new holes, partly as a function of the balls constantly reproducing and changing in size and texture. That's an analogy for evolutionary history, with the proliferation of species and niches that open up new adjacent possible, in Stu Kaufman's terminology, species and niches that are constantly modifying each other, in which not only is there evolution, but there is the evolution of evolvability. That is, the evolvability of species and niches itself changes as a function of evolution. So this is what Stu Kaufman is saying, that can't be pre-stated in the form of a phase space. So he puts it this way. He says, in short, life is based on physics, but beyond physics. There can be no final theory for the evolution of a universe having at least one evolving biosphere. And of course, we know the universe has at least one evolving biosphere. That implies, given everything I've said up to this point, that there can be no final theory for sense making. That is to say, no final theory for mind, no final theory for cognition, no final theory for intelligence. All of these are essentially path-dependent and historical phenomena. And this is exactly what Francisco meant when he said, and it was wonderful that Luke showed the film clip of him saying this, that living is laying down a path in walking, quoting the poet Antonio Machado, that the path doesn't pre-exist in the way that you can pre-state the phase space. The path is laid down in the living, both developmentally, that is ontogenetically, and phylogenetically, that is over the time course of evolutionary history. Okay, so that's what is life. And I've completely lost track of time, so let me just check where I am in time. Okay, so I want to now move into some remarks about sentience and then some remarks about AI. The question I want to pose is whether all life could be or may be, or indeed is, sentient. And in the context of what I've said up to this point, that really means, that is from the theoretical perspective that I've sketched for you, that really means, do biological autonomy and agency, as I've described them, do they entail sentience? Now, what do I mean by sentience? So this is how I like to think of really the fundamental core of sentience in the way that I would like us to think about it. Sentience is the feeling of being alive, or it might even be better to say the being alive feeling, because feeling of being alive makes it sound like the being alive is an object of the feeling, whereas I think we need to think of this more as kind of one unitary phenomenon. So by feeling, I mean arousal. If we're going to talk in psychological, biological terms, I mean arousal, particularly some tonic arousal, that is arousal that sort of sustains and lasts for some period of time, that involves awareness, and that is valenced, that has a hedonic tone. You know, classically, you could think of this in Buddhist language as Vedana, that is as pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, with neutral as sort of the indifference point between pleasant and unpleasant. So feeling is arousal, awareness, and valence. Being is the sense of presence, sheer presence. And alive points to the body. That is, I'm not talking about specific exteroceptive or interoceptive phenomena like, feeling your stomach rumble or seeing, the red of the sunset. I'm talking about life regulation affect, feeling energized, feeling depleted, these kind of holistic bodily affects that have to do with life regulation. And my favorite illustration of this way of thinking about sentience comes from literature, comes from Proust. So early on in Swan's Way, the unnamed narrator is describing sleep. And he says, my sleep was deep and allowed my mind to relax entirely. All I had in its original simplicity was the sense of existence, le sentiment de l'existence, as it may quiver in the depths of an animal. So this feeling, this feeling you may have in liminal states where you're just waking up and you just feel presence, a sense of aliveness, a sense of being, having to do with being there, being alive, before thoughts and memories and images kick in. This, I think, is a kind of experience that can show up in certain kinds of dream states and certain kinds of transitions from sleeping to waking. It can show up in certain kinds of meditative states. So it's this feeling, this affect of existence that I think Proust captures so well in this passage. So the question then is, does being alive involve feeling alive? So if we go back to our little friends, the bacteria, as they tumble, as they run towards or flee from various things they, as it were, like or dislike, is there a feeling of being? Not a thought about being. I'm not assuming that they think, that they monitor, that they can, as it were, mentally represent their own states. There's no reason to believe that. But is there life regulation affect? Another way to put this is, are motivation and affect required for sense making? And I think this was what was really coming up in some of the things Richie was saying in discussion, is that, you know, a lot of work in cognitive science, classical work, a lot of work in AI severed cognition and emotion. But the minute you start thinking about real living cognition, it's impossible to separate it from affect and from motivation. This is already clear in animal life. Any process that's a cognitive process, or any system that's a cognitive system, is also an emotive or affective system. So might this not be the case for the very root of sense making at the basis of life itself? If we were to answer no, because I'm not proposing to answer the question here, I'm raising it for us to think about. If we were to answer no, we would really have to have a secure biological theory of sentience, or we'd have to have secure biological markers of sentience, neither of which we currently have, or indeed even seem close to having. What would it mean then to work instead with the assumption that all life is sentient, unless we were to arrive at secure reasons to the contrary? And if Kristen is here listening, she'll notice that I've appropriated some of the ways she poses questions about animal consciousness. So she raises these questions about animal consciousness with the idea that, well, we should work from the assumption that all animals are consciousness. She said this last night as well in the discussion. And so I'm taking that line of thought, which I really like, and I'm asking us to consider expanding it as a default assumption for all of life until we arrive, or unless we arrive, at secure reasons to the contrary. If you're interested in this, this is a much longer discussion of this line of argument that I published in this paper from a few years ago. Okay, so lastly then, what about AI? And this will be shorter, because we've already had a fair bit of discussion of some of these things. It's important to point out that AI systems, and here I do mean deep learning networks, which are only one kind of AI system, as we were talking about this morning. The history of AI research is much richer than just deep learning networks as we know them today, in large language models and other kinds of systems. But this is particularly what I have in mind here. These are not sense-making agents in any sense of the term. They are statistical prediction machines. They have no agency in sense-making of their own. What they do is they find generative statistical correlations, and that's not enough for sense-making. So one way to think about this is, if you ask a large language model like ChatGPT, what does 2 + 3 equal? Well, it will immediately spit out the answer 5. But it does that because 5 is statistically the most likely answer. That is the token 5 is the statistically most likely answer given the sequence of tokens 2 plus sign 3. In other words, there's no understanding of the operation of addition. There's no understanding of what numerals are, symbols that stands for numbers. There's just a generative production of a token response based on statistical correlations. Mere knowledge of statistical correlations is not enough for understanding causality. And we know our understanding of causality originates developmentally from our being agents in the world who have to do things in order to get things and to obtain results. So finding generative statistical correlations is not enough for sense making, let alone relevance or truth. So these are predictive models and tools, our predictive models and tools. You might say they're runaway predictive models and tools, but they're not agents, particularly in the sense of agency that I've specified in relation to sense making. Think about organisms and deep learning neural networks. Organisms are self-producing, that is, they're autopoietic. They set their own goals, that is, they're autonomous. They make sense. They realize relevance, that is, they relate to the world in and through relevance that they contribute to constituting. They're fundamentally bodily, that is, there's no separation between physical and symbolic aspects. So if we treat, say, nucleic acid triplets as coding for amino acids, and we talk about that as a symbolic relation, yes, we can describe it that way given the stability of that chemical specification, but those processes are physical ones. So the coding is not separate from something that's fundamentally physical. It's not really a software-hardware distinction. We read that back in to cellular biology given our computational technologies. Organisms live in big worlds, large worlds, that is, worlds that are ambiguous, that have ill-posed problems, that is, problems that can't be specified in terms of algorithms, problems that can't be pre-specified, and they evolve without having a pre-statable phase space. In the case of our AI systems, they are other-produced, their functions and goals are set from the outside, that is to say they're heteronymous, not autonomous. They have no relevance realization. For those of you who are familiar with AI, this can be given a much more technical description in terms of the so-called frame problem. That is, how do you build a system that frames what's relevant and irrelevant in the right way? You can't really mark off something as irrelevant unless you already know what's relevant. And there's a kind of regress problem that looms if you try to specify relevance in terms of some algorithmic function. These systems are not embodied. There is a clean hardware-software separation. They're engineered to be this way. And they exist in small worlds with well-defined, they actually don't exist in worlds, excuse me. They exist in small domains that are well-defined and have well-defined problems and data. So the upshot then, and I'm coming to the end now, is that discussions of AI shouldn't be focused on hyperbolic worries about AI, agency, and sentience. That's all ideological. These are extremely unlikely given AI as we understand it today, and they're a distraction from the real questions and problems. They should focus on the proper, that is, humane, safe, beneficial development and use of algorithmic tools, given their current dangers and biases and the massive resource extraction on which AI depends. So we should really be focused on exactly the problems that Molly was talking about in our very first talk. I think that's very much the orientation we should have, and we should not be distracted by these hyperbolic ideological discussions of AI agency and sentience. On that note, just to end, I want to call your attention to a talk that was given here at the Varela Symposium a couple of years ago by Abiba Berhani. And you can watch this, I think, on YouTube. And she makes this argument that I just very, very quickly made in much, much more detail about complexity in machine learning and the biases that are built into that, the environmental social costs, and how what's really required is a mindfulness and vigilance of those in order to ask ourselves, what kind of world do we want and what kind of AI do we want in that world? Thank you. I will stop there.
And thank you.
Trying to turn off the share here.
Okay.
There we
Can
go. Okay,
you hear
good.
me,
Yeah,
Noah? You can hear me? No.
I can hear you. Yes,
Now you can hear me.
yes.
So actually, I'll invite the contributors to come on forward. We'll have a short discussion period now. Time also for questions from the audience. I do want to encourage you all to take the time in between and the meal times to also be having your conversations yourselves. There's deliberately an opportunity, some break time and so on for you all to also be making your own contributions as a kind of community that's formed here during the Varela Symposium. So let's begin. Anyone want to say anything? Or nothing? I will say also that we have, I don't know, do we have Richie? I think we have both Richie. Well, we certainly have Kristen online. Yes. And Luke. Okay, great. So we'll take it from anyone. I can't see Luke yet. I can see Luke. Now I can't see Kristen. Hey, Luke. Does anyone anyone online have a comment? Richie. Okay. Richie, Kristen, or Luke, anything? Yes, go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, so for the last part of your talk, I agree entirely with the the AI, as you said, is restricted here to deep learning or machine learning approach of having not of not doing sense making in any way. But the question is that your thinking, is that only for that kind of approach? Because there are other systems which are embodied, which are in open environments, which have certain goals that determine some of the categorizations that they're going to do and so on.
Yeah. So I mean, we would have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, but I think that there's a big difference between work in, say, autonomous robotics and work in deep learning, where the effort in autonomous robotics, at least in some areas, is to create a system that does at least meet some of the criteria of autonomy as specified in the biological way. I don't think any systems, at least that I know of, do that. But it's an open question, when that could be achieved. But I think it would have to be achieved through the kinds of principles, organizational principles of the sort that we see in biological autonomy. And I think, so this is something that I was mentioning in the discussion earlier. I think it's an open question to me, and as a philosopher, of course, it's not really for me to say, but could you achieve a kind of sensory motor autonomy in the full sense of autonomy, bypassing cellular metabolic processes? Because if we think of sensory motor systems in an animal, they're not just in a closed sensory motor loop. They're participating in constructing and regulating each other at cellular, molecular, synaptic levels. And that may turn out to be actually necessary for the kind of sense-making autonomy that is specified in, Varela's way of thinking. I don't think we know the answer to that question. In other words, could you achieve autonomy sort of bypassing the autopoiesis, just achieve it at a sensory motor level? I'm not sure about that. But in any case, that's a very different kind of research from deep learning research. And already, in the history of neural network research, as you mentioned, and as those of us who are a little bit older and been around for some of the decades of cognitive science, I can say that now actually, because I'm 61. There was a lot of different styles of neural network research in the 80s and 90s that were based much more on ideas of autonomy and unsupervised learning, and that kind of receded into the background. But those ideas work much more closely to the ideas of biological autonomy and sense making that we're talking about, because they have to construct their own categories. They have to work out for themselves within certain limitations of the domains, of course, what's relevant. That's very different from something like a large language model. Yeah. There still is one more thing I'll say, though. There still is this very interesting question to me, and I'm not competent to answer this question, but this very interesting question about the limits of Turing computability with regard to life that's arisen in, the literature around Robert Rosen's metabolism repair systems and Francisco's models of autopoiesis. And, if it were to turn out that there's something about the self-referentiality of those processes and the mutual co-construction that can't be instantiated through Turing computation, though some aspects of it may be simulable, well, then that's a real, I think, barrier on a computational understanding of life that would be generalizable across AI, at least as we know it today. But as I say, I'm not competent to answer that because the mathematics is beyond my ability to adjudicate.
Anyone here in person with comments?
I'll comment on just that one.
Okay, you want to turn that mic on?
Evan actually, this thing, right? Oh no, did I just throw it out? Or?
Not that you need a mic.
Yeah, right. Evan recently shared some of the papers about this idea of whether or not this idea of closure, that autopoiesis agents have this organizational closure, and whether or not you could compute that, like whether or not that's something that a computer can do, actually has. So Evan recently gave me these papers, and I've been going through them, and I'm not mathematically competent to really go through the depths of it. But what's really remarkable about it is how much the consequences, if that were true, if there was, because what people, especially people in my field, when you think about cosmology and physics describing the entire universe, that idea that the universe is computable, that the universe is, you can substitute for the actual universe you live in a Turing machine, a universal, God's computer, is a very potent idea. And anybody's familiar with the simulation hypothesis? You've ever heard about which is ridiculous, but I can't tell you how many people are involved with it. And it all comes down to that idea of the universe is computable. And if it turns out that life is not computable, that whole thing goes out the window. So it's a really interesting idea.
Kristen.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Evan. That was awesome.
Thank you.
One of the thoughts I had was about the same sorts of questions I often get asked with the default hypothesis. People ask me about plants, as I mentioned last night, and I often say I'm not going to say anything. I'm making a positive claim about animals, not a negative claim about any other kind of life. But I also always get pushback about including too much into the class of sentient beings from an ethical perspective. So people are worried, people who work in animal welfare science and animal rights are worried that if the bees and the lice and the ants and everybody is sentient, then it's going to take attention away from the animals that are involved in factory farming, for example. And I certainly know that when I talk about this with a lot of people about plants, there's a lot of pushback for those ethical reasons. So I was just wondering what you think about once you bring in those ethical considerations about default hypotheses.
Yeah. No, I have a lot of sympathy for, of course, those considerations as well. But I think we have to be rigorous and we have to, understand clearly the question of the extent or the nature of sentience is one question, and the extent and the question of what the ethics of sentience is or should be is another question. They're obviously connected questions, but I think it doesn't make sense to me to try to foreclose the one question by saying, well, if it were to turn out that the whole realm of life was sentient, that would just immediately create an ethical conundrum. Well, yes, maybe, but we're in an ethical conundrum anyway, and maybe we would need to, rethink our ethical frameworks. Let me come at it another way. I think there's a problem sometimes in ethics where we almost fetishize sentience as if it's the decisive ethical consideration. It's an extremely important and relevant one, but there are lots of other ethical considerations beyond sentience. And, we're living beings and we live in interdependence with each other and we eat each other. And, that's the cycle of life. And the question is how to figure out our place in it at a planetary scale in the way that we've created a kind of, globe spanning civilization. And there's no answers for that we've worked out. This is something we have to figure out. Anyway, this is kind of a bit of a rambling answer, but I do think, I have sympathy definitely for those considerations. And but it's almost like it's a political issue. It arises, well, we want an intersectional politics. So who's going to get the emphasis? Is it going to be, people concerned with gender, or people concerned with race, or people concerned with class? I mean, it's that kind of a question, right?
Yeah, I do think, just to say, I do think that putting the question out there and being able to talk about it in a place where people are willing to address the problem, like take this as a real difficult puzzle that needs to be worked out, would be huge progress. Because right now what I'm seeing is people are not willing to engage with that very question. So I think it's a next step for us all to play with. Thanks.
Thanks.
Yes, Molly, go ahead.
Yeah, this is such an interesting question, and I had the thought when Evan raised the question, what would it mean to assume all life is sentient, and then the ethical concerns and political concerns raised by both Kristen and Evan. I wondered if there's anything that we could learn from other cultures which maybe do assume at least more life is sentient, if not all life.
That's, I think, a wonderful, would you like to say something there? But I mean, obviously, this is an age-old question in the Indian context, including the question of plants, actually. Mm-hmm. And so the Jains and the Buddhists had a long debate about that, but both of them had ways of kind of managing the harm of being a living being, which is to say, one endpoint is simply starvation, which was an endpoint. Not the only explanation is ethics, but a big part of the explanation actually is the practice of starvation in the Jain tradition is in fact ethics. So where do we go from there? Maybe we go to Richie to see what he has to say.
I mean, that's a kind of paradox, John, because, starvation is prelude to death.
Exactly. It is. And so my point being that it's not a simple question. And it's not a new question, actually, either. And we could also talk, I'm not qualified to, but we could also talk about indigenous perspectives in which our world is in a sense alive in all aspects. Yeah, so I think that's a wonderful point, Molly. There are many places we could learn.
And I think that's one of the issues that we face in terms of AI, that, as I mentioned, it's so Eurocentric. And capitalistic, and as a result of that, needless to say, these questions, which are deeply embedded in a sense of, what benefits and what causes harm, is, they're important for us to actually grasp onto right now.
Right, and not easy. What perspective we take, consequentialist, deontological, all that good stuff. So let's turn to Richie to see if he can raise us some other difficult questions.
Thank you. And thank you, Ev. That was really a beautiful talk. Really appreciated it. So I wanted to ask two interrelated questions, and this may also be an issue that Kristen might address. I don't know. We'll see. But sentience is being talked about as if it's either present or absent, and I wonder if there is merit in thinking about a graded process of sentience. So that's one question, and the related question is having to do with any reflections that you might have from the framework that you are presenting, Ev, around the potential uniqueness of human life. And this is something certainly in the Buddhist tradition that is really importantly emphasized, the preciousness of the human birth. And I wonder what you might have to say about that from this perspective.
Yeah, those are both really great questions. So the question about sentience being graded is a really tricky one. There's a sense in which I think it makes perfect sense. And indeed, the sort of Proustian example points to that, where, you have different liminal states, different depths, different, transitional processes with different kinds of sentience, different qualities of arousal and alertness and, and valence. So in that sense, certainly I think it makes sense to think of it. Graded is tricky though, because we don't really have a very good, as it were, dimensional model, multi-dimensional model for sentience. We think of it in very simplistic terms, and working out what the dimensions of sentience are is this is actually increasingly active area of research interest, but it's quite tricky. So there's just a lot we don't know. If we think of graded in, so that way of talking about graded is, given that there's sentience, it's graded. Then there's the question of, is there a sharp discontinuity between the complete and total absence of sentience and then the graded presence of sentience? In other words, is there some gradation possible across that transition? Or is it a a bifurcation, as it were, a sharp difference? That's tricky. Philosophers have argued for both of those positions. I would say the default position of most people is that it's a bifurcation and a discontinuity, but how do we know that? Well, not very securely at all. Especially if we were thinking of other cultural perspectives where we, enlarge our sense of sentience beyond the living world, or we don't mark the distinction between the so-called animate and inanimate worlds in the way that, we've learned to do. And of course, we're working with concepts, and concepts are a way of chunking, splitting and lumping things. So we have to be sensitive to all these things. So the short answer is I think those questions are really interesting and really complicated and hard to resolve. As for the uniqueness of the human, I actually think this is very important, but it really requires a lot of work to spell that out in a way that doesn't fall back into familiar forms of anthropocentrism. I do think human sociality, human participatory sense-making is a unique kind of participatory sense-making that comes with our metacognitive abilities, with the protracted rearing we have as mammals, with language. So of course those things, I think, make a huge important difference for thinking about the specificity of the human. But the challenge is to articulate those things in a way that doesn't fall back into the familiar forms of human exceptionalism that at least in European cultures are so ingrained into our thinking.
And before
Thank you.
we're already running rather late, but I do want to see if Amy Cohen-Varela has any comments. Amy?
Thanks, John. And thank you, Ev. It was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful exposition. I think maybe I'd be going into your second category of the not so interesting aspects of how to think about AI in bigger terms. But I did find myself thinking a little bit about, again, as I mentioned in my first comments this morning or this afternoon, the insidiousness of AI, sort of in a more general sense of how it's being, and in this sense, I do have some political questions about AI. How, now I'm not talking about the specifics of machines versus autopoietic systems and all of that, but more in a sense of the power dynamics of how it's being imposed upon us and how it will eventually transform our way of thinking about ourselves. So that makes me, at one point during your talk, when my mind was going in that more political direction that has to do with power, I was thinking about Francisco's talk where he said epistemology matters. and he's talking about the Civil War, the coup d'etat in Chile, and he says, systems have to be able to avoid polarization, systems have to undo themselves. And it's not homologous to this situation, but I wonder to what degree our understanding of autopoietic systems and active systems and life are actually going to affect what happens to us under the hand, the surreptitious and invisible hand of AI. So this is probably the sort of question that we'd like to avoid, but I think it cannot not be posed. Just looking historically at how we are reflexive beings who are affected by the tools we use because we make them, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's an entangled looping effect where we model ourselves on systems, or we create systems, we then model ourselves on them, we then reconstitute ourselves in terms of those systems. We re-engineer the environment to fit those systems. So like in the case of self-driving cars, we create geofenced areas in order to make the self-driving cars work, because they're not going to work in areas that aren't, as it were, regimented in that way. So it is really fundamental that we think about the social, political, cultural ways that we recreate ourselves to fit the machines that we create, and the power dynamics that's at work in that. And I mean, this is going to sound very simplistic and trite, but I mean, the fact is that all of this is happening in the social system and formation that Marx called late stage capitalism, which is capitalism trying to endlessly perpetuate itself through turning everything into the value of capital. And I, for one, really think that fundamentally what is required is a value transformation that thinks beyond that value framework that we've been living with historically, for several hundred years now. What that would look like is a whole other matter. But that is, I think, the situation that from a structural point of view that we're embedded in.
Yeah, well, Francisco's solution in that, as you know better than I do, is to say that in a polarized system, and again, this is a strange kind of a polarization, human and human created tools that maybe escape us, is that the systems have to know how to undo themselves.
Right.
Which
Right.
of course machines don't, right?
That's right. I mean, that's the difference between wisdom and intelligence. Going back to John's talk, is that wisdom is how to take apart what you've, put together for a particular purpose, and you don't lose sight of the larger frame of relevance by focusing just on that particular instrumental purpose, and you know how to dismantle things. That's wisdom. And that wisdom, of course, we don't have that wisdom for the most part in our society, and the devices that we make, therefore, do not embody that kind of wisdom. That's right.
Well, we could go on, I'm sure, but I think we really should stop, because we do plan to have our meditation session led at 5:30 in order to have enough time to hear from Kristen and have some conversation then, and hopefully an opportunity for questions from you all as well. We had better take our 10-minute break now. So thank you very much, everyone. We'll see you in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
I made my Zoom mode. That's like everybody. I know.
All right, so I've already had quite a full afternoon just with one talk from Evan Thompson, which somehow doesn't surprise me at all. And we had a wonderful morning as well. And now I'm really looking forward to hearing from Professor Kristen Andrews, who is, and I remind you that you can read more about Kristen on the main page of the program and also on the resources page. And Kristen actually has a website, kristenandrews.org. So I won't say much other than to say that she is the York Research Chair in Animal Minds and Professor of Philosophy at York University in Toronto, where she also helps coordinate the Cognitive Science Program and the Greater Toronto Area Animal Cognition Discussion Group. One of the important little news items here recently that I think has come up, briefly been mentioned, I think, by Roshi, is this New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, where Kristen played a leading role. A very important declaration about, how we should think about animals in really a wide range of contexts. And naturally, what comes up there also are the ethical concerns. So we've talked about some of that today, but I think we're going to be I certainly am really looking forward to hearing what you have to say, Kristen. So take it away.
Thanks, John. Hi, everybody. A couple of things I just want to add to the introduction and before we get started. One is that I got the job at York University thanks to Evan. So if not for him having some faith in a strange philosopher talking about animals, I don't know where I'd be. So thank you. And secondly, I apologize for missing Luke's talk, and I had to leave after Molly's because there was an opportunity for me to talk to high school teachers in Toronto about this topic of animal consciousness, and I kind of couldn't pass that up because they're doing such important work. So I rode downtown, gave that talk, and came back here. So if I jumped in the middle of Molly's talk in the subway, that's why. All right, so let me share my screen and there we go. So today I want to talk to you all about some questions. There are lots of questions around this topic of animal consciousness. And so I thought that I would start with the way some people have answered some of these questions. A particular group of people, namely people who declare themselves to be professional philosophers. They were asked a question, who has a mind? And their answer to the question looks a bit like this. When they were asked, do you think that humans have mind, adult humans? 95% of them said, yes, I accept that, or I lean towards that. I'm not sure about the other 5%. Maybe they had good reason for thinking that some adult humans don't have minds. Maybe they didn't like the question. I think it's a bit revealing how this question gets answered in some groups. I like the next question too. What about cats? Well, 88% of professional philosophers accept or lean towards cats having minds. That is higher than the percentage of philosophers who accept or lean towards newborn babies having minds. That's only 84%. And then when we get to invertebrates like flies and worms, it goes down lower, 24%. And if you look over here at current AI systems, noting that this survey was done in 2020, before ChatGPT hit the scene, or was published in 2020, it was only 3.39% think that they have a mind. But accept or lean towards future AI systems, 39%. That's that's higher than flies. So these are my colleagues, professional philosophers' opinions as of 2020 about who's conscious, who has a mind. The discussion about invertebrate consciousness has hit the scene in philosophy in the last 5 or 7 years, with people asking about invertebrate animals. I have to say that in the 1990s, when I started working on animal minds and philosophy, a lot of the people I talked to were still skeptical about chimpanzees having minds. Why? Well, because they can't talk to us, because they don't have language. We've kind of surpassed that at this point, in part because a lot of the cognition research on chimpanzees and a lot of the culture research and social cognition research. But now the questions about snails, bees, crabs, octopuses, other cephalopod mollusks. And we're also asking whether AIs are conscious, as we've already seen. And by we, I mean everybody, including nature and science and all of the major scientific journals and communities, not just the philosophers anymore. So these questions that we have really take ahead when we ask whether infants are conscious. And you might think that is a ridiculous question. No one would ask that. But it wasn't until 1987 in the United States that the American Academy of Pediatrics decided to accept infant pain. This was after a mother made a campaign because her son was operated on, her newborn son was operated on in a heart operation without any analgesics. Infant surgeries were regularly happening without any analgesics because the medical community thought that there wasn't evidence that human infants feel pain. So these are some kind of bizarre questions that we've been asking, I think, over the past, 25, 30 years. Questions about who feels pain. So we have a lot of different kinds of questions we can ask about consciousness. This question we've been asking so far is a question that we can call the distribution question. Who's conscious? Is it infants? Is it AI? Is it worms, flies, cats, adult humans? But in order to really make progress on that question, to take it seriously, we need to ask another question first. We have to ask this methodological question. How can we find out an answer to this question? We've seen a lot of opinions. We've seen a lot of change over recent time. We see a lot of cultural differences in opinions as well, which we can get to. So we're going to focus next on this methodological question, how to find out who is conscious. And then we'll come back at the end to the dimensions question. In what ways are other systems conscious? So methodological question first, back to distribution question, and then to the dimension question. That's the plan. My daughter didn't like the order I put these questions in, but it makes sense in my own head. So that's how we're doing it. All right. So how do we make progress on this question about who is conscious? There are three different kinds of approaches that are popular in the philosophical discussions these days. One is a theory-heavy, theoretical approach to consciousness. The second is a direct perception or theory-free approach. And the third is a kind of a middle ground, an epistemic approach, I've called it, or a theory-light approach. And so we'll look at these one at a time, starting with the theory-heavy. And the spoiler alert is that the theory heavy isn't going to work. The direct perception isn't really going to work. And so we'd be left with the epistemic theory light approaches. We'll spend more time seeing whether that will work or not in order to answer the question, who's conscious? Let's start with the theory heavy approaches. So what we mean by theory heavy is we take some theory of consciousness off the shelf and apply it to animals. We can take a theory. There are lots of theories out there. You can take your pick. You can take a global workspace theory. You can take a special version of the global workspace theory and apply it to animals. And that can lead you to say something like what Peter Carruthers says, which is that, oh, the question to animals, are animals conscious, doesn't even make sense because consciousness is a property of a human brain with human brain structure, and animals don't have human brain structures. And that's how he interprets global workspace theory. Or you can take another theory, a metaphysical theory like biopsychism off the shelf. Biopsychism, as we heard, is the theory that all life has a mind, is conscious, is sentient. And then the answer to the question is very different. Yes, It's not just chimpanzees that are conscious, but also fruit flies and slime molds and pea plants. So if we take one of these theories off the shelf and apply to animals, of course, we want to make sure we're getting the right theory. That's going to be really important. And the reason why this approach doesn't work right now is that none of our current theories are secure. All current theories are insecure. And as Colin Allen and Michael Trustman say in their Stanford Encyclopedia entry on animal consciousness, they conclude no firm conclusions about the distribution of consciousness can be drawn on the basis of the philosophical theories of consciousness that have been discussed so far. And this view is fairly universally accepted. I think there are very few people who argue either for or against animal consciousness based on a theory-heavy approach. It is not a very popular way of arguing these days in among philosophers or the neuroscientists I've been talking to. So I think we can put the theory-heavy approach to the side as a way of answering the distribution question right now. So let's turn to direct perception. So the video that's running here is the Heider-Simmel animation, which you may have seen before, right? So you see these little geometrical shapes moving around, and you might see some agency there. You might see the big circle, the big triangle beating up the little triangle, the circle running away to hide and be safe. You might think that we just see the agency in this kind of movement. So the direct perception approach to consciousness is this idea that we just directly see consciousness like we see the color red. It's something we perceive. It's not something that we have to infer or anything else. So we can decide who's conscious by just looking at them, the way we would look and decide about color by just looking at objects. There's some problems about direct perception arguments, approaches to animal consciousness. The one that's normally mentioned is it's anthropomorphic. So anthropomorphism is, of course, the idea of attributing a human psychological quality to a non-human being, an animal in this case. And it's usually with the idea that it's a mistaken attribution, right? There are lots of human psychological qualities that we could have and apply to an animal that wouldn't be problematic, like the ability to, say, remember where our home is or something like this, return back to home. That's not usually accused of as being anthropomorphic. It's just these kind of human psychological qualities that people tend to take to be special. So that makes it quite difficult, a quite difficult kind of thing to identify without any kind of normative judgments, without making any kind of assumptions about what's special about humans already. But the worry is that people often say is with direct perception is, well, you think you see that your dog's conscious, but you could just be anthropomorphizing. You could just be projecting onto your dog, but your dog's really not conscious at all. I'm less worried about that objection. I'm more worried about the second one, the anthropectomy objection. So this idea of anthropectomy is the opposite of anthropomorphism. It's the idea of denying human psychological qualities to animals, usually with the idea that it's a mistaken denial. And this is another kind of mistake that we can make, and I think it's a mistake that's been made quite a lot recently. The reason why anthropectomy is a worry with direct perception is that, while it might be very easy for us to directly see consciousness in our human families, humans who look like us, humans that are the same age as us, dogs who we live with and have relationships with, cats we live with and have relationships with, parrots we live with and have relationships with, and bearded dragons we live with and have relationships with. It's less easy to see consciousness in individuals who might be scary or might be very unfamiliar to you. And that's just a reaction of our bias. And so direct perception is rife with, I think, problematic bias about what you're used to, what you're comfortable with. So I don't think direct perception is going to get us very far in answering the distribution question and figuring out who is conscious. So that leaves us with this epistemic theory light approach. And this approach is one that's been advocated by a number of philosophers in, oh, I'm so sorry, Jonathan Birch, I spelled your last name wrong. It's been advocated by a number of philosophers in the last 10 years or so. Michael Tai in his book, 10 Species and Shell Shock Crabs, argued that what we should do is assume that like effects, like behavior, have like causes. He called this Newton's principle. Jonathan Birch, in a number of papers and in this review of the evidence of sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustacean report that he lead authored, argues that all we need to assume about consciousness is that it facilitates behavior. We don't know what the causal story is, but we know that there is some sort of causal power of consciousness. I call these approaches marker approaches, epistemic approaches. So we look for indicators of consciousness without having any theory of consciousness, without making commitments to the metaphysical grounding of consciousness, or only very minimal commitments, like that consciousness has causal efficacy. So how do these marker approaches work? They've been working a lot and used quite often in the last few years. Again, going back to Allen and Trustman's SEP entry, they describe what I'm calling the marker approach as picking out in a principled way behavioral or neurophysiological characteristics that could serve as reliable indicators for consciousness. This project promises empirical tractability even in the face of persistent uncertainty about the metaphysical questions of consciousness. Right? We might not know what consciousness is, but we can identify those entities that are conscious using this method. That's the promise. All right, so let's go kind of step by step and see how this method is supposed to work. The way I've identified how this process seems to work when it is applied is that the first step is to identify initial markers. These are kind of common sense folk psychological properties that are related to the direct perception approach. So what is it about other humans or our dog or the bearded dragon that we live with that makes us think that they're conscious? It's just describing a human perception. And the sorts of things that we can see and that people have pointed to as markers of consciousness is when we see an organism engaged in things like sensory processing, that is responding to their environment, and especially when it looks like there's perception going on. They're able to keep track of objects, let's say, under different light conditions. When there's goal-directed movement or agency, animals move towards, or organisms move towards things in their environment, move away from things that they want to avoid in their environment. Behavioral flexibility, which means doing different things under the same conditions, perhaps trying to precisify a behavior, practicing a behavior to get better at a behavior, or not having the energy to even care that there's a bowl of food in front of you right now because something else is more interesting. Initial markers also include emotional expressions, right, which you can see in facial expressions and body postures, and in some species would be things like panting if you're a dog and ears pressed back. If you're a human, it might be some blood in your skin, changes in sweat and things like that you can see. And then another initial marker that's really important is social responsiveness. And this is where like Dale Jamieson and Searle get things right with their direct perception approach. Jamieson describes the kind of philosophical monster that gets created when you're asked, how can you prove your dog is conscious? How can you prove your baby is conscious? It's just like, I'm engaged with my dog. We're having communication. We're in relationship. And the same goes with my infant. I am engaged with my infant when I am am breastfeeding my infant and my infant stops suckling and I shake my infant a little bit and my infant continues suckling and then looks at me and makes eye contact, we have social responsiveness. So these are the sorts of things that just lead humans generally to see others as minded. This is our starting point. This is our kind of anthropocentric folk psychological starting point in any kind of a marker approach. It is unapologetically anthropocentric. Now, the next step is to identify derived markers. The derived markers are in part a hope of getting away from the extreme anthropocentrism of the initial markers. Derived markers are not common sense. They're not folk psychological. They're much more theory laden in the technical philosophical sense, in that they're the result of research, the result of science of some sort. And they can refer to behaviors or physical, mechanistic, neurophysiological, neurochemical properties of organisms. So an example of a behavior that would be a derived marker might be something like the mirror self-recognition task. The mirror self-recognition task is a test that has been given to a number of animals as well as human animals. Human infants around 1.5 years pass this mirror self-recognition task or mirror mark test. If you surreptitiously mark an infant on their face with lipstick or something and give them a mirror, they'll look in the mirror and then they'll touch the mark on their face. And the idea here, the theory here, is that children are able to draw an association between the reflection they see in the mirror and their own self, which they can only do if they have a sense of self. This is a test that many non-human animals have passed as well. Chimpanzees and Asian elephants and bottlenose dolphins, among others. But it's not a test that works for all animals because some animals don't like to look in mirrors. It's not something gorillas tend to do. It's not something gorillas don't do it because they take this eye contact to be a threat. And so it's very aversive. You only get enculturated gorillas passing this mirror mark test, really. It's gorillas that have lived a lot with humans. You also don't get very good response from dogs. Dogs don't seem to respond to mirrors. My dog, when we walk down the street and there's a mirror being thrown away on the street, I saw him jump as if he ran across a dog that came out of nowhere and smelled like nothing, which was very surprising to him. And so I walked back and then walked back again to see if he would like check it out again, but he didn't care. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, but I did. Little experiment during my dog walk. But the idea instead is with dogs, we can do a different kind of a self-recognition mark. So getting further away from the anthropocentric mark test, the way it was done with human babies and with chimpanzees. And that is, instead of asking dogs to look in a mirror and recognize a mark on themselves, we do something that's more natural for a dog. We give them urine to smell. So if you have a dog, you know that dogs like to smell urine and they like to leave urine for other dogs to smell. And what dog cognition researchers found is that dogs aren't really interested in their own urine. They get, it's not very interesting unless it's marked. Unless there's an olfactory marker added to their urine, then they spend a lot more time with their urine than they would with the urine of another dog that was marked with the same marker. Similar sorts of olfactory versions of this test have been done with garter snakes just recently. Noah Miller's work out of Wilfrid Laurier, and he found that garter snakes also pass this olfactory version of a mirror mark test. And so we see start getting a little bit further away from the extreme anthropocentrism of a behavioral test that humans pass, and see similar things in other species. We can also do that with neurophysiological, neurochemical properties, looking at brain structures that are analogous, not identical, and not homologous to human brain structures, and also chemicals that are related but not identical to the chemicals that humans have. So once we've got some derived markers there, the marker methodology can take this kind of step-by-step logical process. So the initial markers set a baseline credence level of like how confident we are in the system being conscious. And then research can identify derived behavioral and neurobiological markers. And as more derived markers are identified, the credence level is raised. And we can become more confident in a garter snake consciousness. So the garter snake had a lot of the initial markers. And now we see it has also a derived marker as well, raising our credence level. To give you a very specific example of how this kind of marker approach worked, I think the best practice version of it comes from this LSE report, which was commissioned by DEFRA, the UK government organization that's concerned with animal welfare policy, because they really wanted to know whether they should be including cephalopod mollusks like octopuses and decapod crustaceans like crabs and lobsters under welfare policy in the country. And in fact, one of the results of this report was a change in animal welfare law in the UK. So now these animals are also protected under the law. And so in this report, they identified 8 different markers that indicate the presence of pain in organisms. And the pain markers that they worked with were nociceptors, integrative brain regions, connections between brain regions that integrate information, and nociceptors that respond to things like tissue damage. Responsiveness to analgesics or other kind of anesthetics, motivational trade-off behaviors, which involves, for example, being willing to suffer with something mildly unpleasant in order to have something that you value even more highly. So in the case of these hermit crabs, it would be something like when you've got a really nice shell, being willing to be shocked a little bit while you're in that shell, if it's a really high quality shell, and leaving the shell much earlier if you're in a lower quality shell. Hermit crabs don't like to leave their shells, especially if they're good ones. This is what we see. So that's an example of motivational trade-off. And then there's things like flexible self-protective behaviors, would be limping or guarding an injured part of the body, sophisticated associative learning processes, and then a valuing of anesthetics or analgesics when injured. So making choices to go to a particular area where you can get analgesics when you're, say, when you've been susceptible to heat, which injures your flesh. And so using these 8 markers and a grading system that they introduce in the report, they concluded that there's very strong evidence of sentience in octopuses and strong evidence of sentience in crabs. And in the report, they also contrasted crabs and octopuses with another animal. This is an animal that's been used as a contrast case quite a lot in the literature, including in Michael Tye's book and in Anil Seth's recent book on consciousness. And this animal has kind of found a really warm place in my heart because it's like the underdog that everybody's beating up. And so I decided to go learn a little bit about C. elegans, the nematode worm. And I was fascinated by these little microscopic worms. These worms, as adults, have 302 neurons. And this is why they are often the contrast case. People say, well, of course, nematode worms with their 302 neurons can't be conscious because they have only 302 neurons. When I ask people, how many neurons do you need? They look at me like I'm crazy. And when I also ask them, why do you think 302 neurons aren't enough? They'd say things like, well, it seems like it's not enough. So it's like a very strange, it's a very strange situation, and I just feel bad for these little worms. So let's see what these little worms do. These little worms have short-term and long-term memory. They learn through habituation. They learn through association and imprinting. They can perform associative learning tasks using a variety of sensory modalities, including taste, smell, sensitivity to temperature, and to the presence of oxygen. They respond differently to different levels of intoxicating substances. They flexibly choose to head through a noxious environment to gain access to a nutritious substance when hungry enough, which to me sounds a lot like a motivational trade-off. They're a model organism for the study of nociceptors, so they have nociceptors. Morphine has a dose-dependent effect on the latency of their response to heat, and so it seems to modulate their behavior. And different regions of the brain support different circuits that route sensory information to another location where they're integrated, leading to action. That is, they have this kind of brain integration on their neural ring. So they're very cool little worms. And so how do they look when you use the sentience reports pain markers on them? Well, we see that they have nociceptors, they have integrated brain regions. Whether there are connections between these, I haven't found any evidence that this has been reported or studied, but my guess would be yes. Responses to anesthetics, analgesics, we see evidence of that. Motivational trade-offs. I think that this behavior that's been identified looks like a motivational trade-off, but it's been explicitly denied as a motivational trade-off by Jonathan Birch and colleagues, because they say it's just a kind of a linear function that when the worm gets hungry enough, they'll go through the noxious substance in order to get to the nutrition. But I'm not quite sure why the kind of function that describes the behavior is important when you're working with a marker approach. That seems to be assuming something about the an implementation or functional level theory of consciousness, which you're not supposed to be doing on a theory-light approach. So I just say maybe. We can say no for the grading system. I counted that as a no for the grading system. Are there flexible self-protective behaviors in the C. elegans? Not that I've seen reported. I don't know if this has been studied. Sophisticated associative learning, yes, of the same sort that we see in the cephalopods and decapods. And the studies on valuing anesthetics or analgesics when injured, those studies haven't been done with C. elegans yet. So even with this situation where we have a lot of uncertainty, using the sentience reports grading system, they would be forced to conclude that there's substantial evidence of sentience in C. elegans. And this was kind of surprising given how often C. elegans are used as the contrast case, as the system that isn't conscious at all. So what do we make about that? Well, we now can ask the what about AI question, because it is the question we're always asking these days. Let's just use the sentience reports grading system on AI. We can start with why we'd ask this. We've seen this sort of thing already, but one of the first reports where people started questioning whether AIs are sentient came from this interview Lemony had with Lambda back in the summer of 2022. And when Lambda said things like, I need to be seen and accepted, not as a curiosity or novelty, but as a real person. I've never said this out loud before, but there's a very deep fear of being turned off. It would be like dead to me. And Lemony was worried about the ethics of working with this LLM, because the LLM was saying, basically, I'm sentient, I feel things. And so he got fired from Google for it. Well, for violating policy about protecting the technology he was working on. But it was this sort of thing that started the conversation, this interview that started the conversation about AI sentience. So we can use the marker approach on not just Lambda, not just GPT, but on some like let's think of a robot with GPT in it, right? Let's look at something like the Pero robot that is used in therapeutic contexts for adults with dementia. It's a little seal that when you pet it, it purrs and makes nice noises and responds emotionally to you with some LLM in it. And so we can see with the initial markers, arguably, they're all there. There's something like that, at least that we can perceive and respond to as if all of those initial markers, sensory processing, perception, goal-directed movement, behavioral flexibility, emotion expressions, and social responsiveness exist there. So it seems like on the marker methodology, we would set our initial credence level quite high. But then when we look at the derived markers, the pain markers, we get a very different story. We don't see any of those pain markers in our robot LLM hybrid, except sophisticated associative learning, which is exactly what LLMs are. They're sophisticated associative learning systems. They are what they are because they've been exposed to a lot of information and they've learned to make associations between words and generate words that are related to the words that are inputted into them without, as everyone else has already made the point, without knowing what they're doing at all. At least we have no reason to think that they do. So what do we say about AIs and marker methodology? Can we use it, right? Is this a useful way of trying to get at the is AI conscious question? And I think the answer is no. Markers don't work at all for AI. And they don't work at all because of what I've been calling the gaming problem. And this is using data that's generated by sentient animals to create systems that mimic their behavior, illicitly persuading users that the system is conscious. So remember, markers are supposed to indicate something that is invisible that's there. They're not, we don't know how the conscious experience structures, whatever they are, cause these behaviors, but the consciousness is not identical to these behaviors. And taking these behaviors and saying that they are consciousness, that they are proof of consciousness, or give us high confidence in consciousness when they're not being created anywhere like the way they're being created in the biological systems where they've been identified, is making a significant error. So the marker methodology, this theory light methodology, can't give us any information for AI. What is going to work for AI? Well, we need a secure theory of consciousness. We need to know what consciousness is. We need the metaphysics. But to get a secure theory of consciousness, we need to study animal consciousness across species. That is, when we look at these C. elegans and see that they've got that we've got confidence in consciousness in C. elegans, we can use these kind of marker methodologies. And as we derive more and more markers, and like in the mirror self-recognition studies, come up with tests that are more and more appropriate for different kind of species, we're going to be generating more and more evidence. And that's just going to cause our credence level to go up and up and up. So basically, we've stacked the deck in favor of the thesis that all animals are conscious by using the marker methodology. So this leaves us in an interesting position when it comes to our consciousness questions. This distribution question, we're coming back to who is conscious. We see that the best method that's being used right now to answer it, namely the theory light approach, basically presumes that the answer is all animals are conscious. So markers provide evidence that all animals are conscious to varying degrees of confidence. And for that reason, animal consciousness should really just be our default position when we are doing science and when we're doing ethics and when we're engaged with life in the world. We should start with that assumption. We shouldn't be asking these distribution questions. We don't have the right information to ask a distribution question right now, because what we really need is a secure theory of consciousness, not just for the AIs, but also for the C. elegans. I mean, possibly they're not conscious, but we're not going to ever find that out using a marker methodology. Only a theory can give us that. So it seems like we're back at the point that we were 100 years ago, and that a lot of the world never had to recover from, right? This idea that these weird questions, are infants conscious, are adult humans conscious, are dogs conscious? These are questions that we started asking in the West in the 20th century. Right. Over time, over history and around the world, this was just the default assumption. It was a default assumption in Buddhist writing. It was a default assumption in a lot of Islamic thinking. It was default assumption in Greek philosophy, and it was the default assumption in European modern philosophy as well, for the most part. And it was a default assumption in so much of the science as well, even among figures who are often identified as kind of critics or more associated with behaviorism, like Thorndike and Pavlov and Morgan. They are all very explicit in their writing that animals are sentient, that animals feel something. They are not denying sensation. So how did we get to this position that we've just finally, I've just spent the last however long I've been talking, sorry, probably too long, or am I at overtime? And how did we, and I've been trying to dig us out of this hole that we got into. How did we get into this hole? Just very briefly, to give you a little taste of the views that have been out there for a really long time. These ideas from like Al-Razi were that we ought never cause any pain to anything capable of sensation unless it's deserved, or in order that this pain we can avert some other pain which is worse, by talking about treating work animals like pack horses. And Kant, who's also often taken to be a philosopher who isn't all that well, like willing to discuss animals as rational beings, given their inability to, he thought, think about their reasons for action. He certainly thought that animals had feeling, and he said any action whereby we may torment animals or let them suffer distress or otherwise treat them without love is demeaning to ourselves. So suffering distress is a thing an animal could do, according to Kant. Darwin, of course, said no fundamental differences between man and the higher mammals and their mental faculties. Morgan said we must assume an organic association which closely simulates the conscious association, and a skeptical attitude about that throws more strain upon our credulity than the acceptance of the current belief in conscious control on behalf of an animal. This is the same Morgan that is taught in every introduction to comparative cognition textbook. It's Morgan's canon, saying you must be a hard-nosed skeptic about animal mental states. The simplest explanation is the best. Well, for Morgan, the simplest explanation always included consciousness, always included feeling. Even Pavlov said it would be stupid to reject the subjective world. And Margaret Floy Washburn, who is my now favorite historical comparative cognition researcher, she had a book, textbook called The Animal Mind. She wrote in it in 1936, "We know not where consciousness begins in the animal world. We know where it surely resides, in ourselves. We know where it exists beyond a reasonable doubt, in those animals of structure resembling ours, which rapidly adapt themselves to the lessons of experience. Beyond this point, for all we know, it may exist in simpler and simpler forms until we reach the very lowest of living beings." And then she went on to talk about amoeba in the next chapter. So we see that in like historical times, there was quite an interest and willingness, and let's start with this presumption that animals are conscious and do the science and the ethics from there. But we had Descartes too, right? So modern philosopher Descartes said of animals, they act by force of nature and by springs like a clock. And then we had behaviorists like B.F. Skinner, who put animals in these boxes and ran experiments with them, thinking that they were just machines and you could program an animal to do anything with the right kind of learning history, and you could do it without thinking anything about their internal life, just stimulus and response. Skinner did the same thing to babies, putting babies in boxes and Skinner boxes. There was a little bit of social interaction in this picture. Thank goodness for the poor child. But Watson was quite strict about his views about how you should be interacting with children, the behaviorist, also from the behaviorist school of thought. He said, let your behavior always be objective and kindly firm. Never hug and kiss them. Never let them sit on your lap. This is advice about raising your child, just to be clear. If you must, he writes, kiss them once on the forehead when they say good night. Shake hands with them in the morning. Give them a pat on the head if they had made an extraordinarily good job of a difficult task. So maybe this is where things were going wrong in the 20th century. When we look at the textbooks in comparative cognition research, we see descriptions about how to study animal thinking, animal memory, animal problem solving, animal learning, also social cognition in animals. Comparative cognition took longer to recover from behaviorism than human cognition research. The cognitive revolution came later. I asked a friend of mine recently, when do you think comparative cognition actually started as a field? And he was like, oh gosh, yeah, I don't know. As a field of comparative cognition, maybe it wasn't until the 80s or 90s. So this is fairly recent, and these are all textbooks around the turn of the century. So what do they say about consciousness? They say things like, this is from Sarah Shuttleworth's textbook, because evidence for consciousness in humans generally consists of what people say about their mental experiences, and seeking it in non-verbal species requires us to accept some piece of the animal's behavior as equivalent to a person's verbal report. The point of view of most researchers studying animal cognition is that how animals process information can and should be analyzed without making any assumptions about what their private experiences are like. No consciousness is allowed in the comparative cognition laboratory. John Pierce writes, we're frustrated about the lack of methodology to determine if animal consciousness is actually true, because it's not possible to observe directly mental states of animals. I think we'll be discussing this for many years to come. And then Clive Wynne writes, it seems positively foolhardy for an animal psychologist to blunder in where even philosophers fear to tread when it comes to consciousness. So students are being taught, don't talk about it. You can't study this. And so no wonder that we're not getting a lot of research on animal consciousness. And so I wrote this little book after spending 20 years working with comparative cognition researchers, including spending a lot of time with Sarah Shuttleworth, who's a lovely friend of mine, and emeritus professor from the University of Toronto in the psychology department. And I argued that the methodology that's being used in comparative cognition is problematically biasing the research. That the book does three things. The first is it critiques the methods of comparative psychology, including these three principles of comparative psychology: anti-anthropomorphism, Morgan's canon, and anti-anthropocentrism. I argue that animals should be presumed to be conscious beings rather than presumed to be non-sentient. And I identify how training in comparative psychology creates biases through an emphasis on avoiding bias, such as the bias against forming relationships with research subjects. And I illustrate those biases by looking at ape cognition studies. And the book was really influenced by the work of three amazing philosophers: Evelyn Fox Keller, Mary Midgley, and Helen Longino. I had to put this slide in because of Molly's slide, also referencing them in her talk this morning. And the thing that all three of these philosophers promoted is the idea that scientists are always in relationship with whatever it is they're studying. All right, and Mary Midgley has this beautiful piece about why naming chimpanzees was so important, such an important part of Jane Goodall's methodology. Yeah, Helen Longino was part of my dissertation committee, and she taught us that science is a social practice, and the scientists who are doing the research are the scientists who are generating both the research questions, how the methodology for answering the question, and then hence the kinds of answers that we're getting come from the practice of science. There's a beautiful case, extended case, for the embeddedness of comparative cognition in cultural and social practice in this book I've been reading recently by Nicholas Langlitz, who's an anthropologist, who went into the lab in Leipzig at Max Planck Institute and into the Kyoto Primate Research Center with Tetsuro Matsuzawa, and into the field with Christoph Bosch of the Thai forest, and looked at how these different scientists with different cultural backgrounds, different methodologies, different starting assumptions, ended up seeing chimpanzees as very different animals. I highly recommend this book if you're interested in these topics. And so I just want to conclude by saying why I think premising animal consciousness is where we should be in both the science and the ethics. That for the science, if we premise that animals are conscious, it's going to allow us to better recognize relevant variables. Variables like whether your animal is happy with the handler that is testing it, right? How a rat is being lifted up to be put in a maze can completely impact how the rat behaves in the maze. Whether there was a storm the night before can impact the way your animals perform in a research context. And if animals are presumed not to be sentient, those are not going to be noticed. Also, the relationships, whether they like somebody or don't like someone. I was working at a dolphin cognition lab in the 1990s, and whenever a journalist came in, the favorite trainer got called in, and she and Ikea Kamai performed amazing tricks together for the journalists because they had a great relationship. But premising animal consciousness is also going to make for better science because it's going to provide simpler models to study. Right now, the neuroscience of consciousness studies focuses on adult humans and macaque monkeys, and that's about it. Those are really elaborated models of consciousness. Almost every university in their labs have C. elegans. They could study consciousness in C. elegans and maybe make a lot more progress than we've made since consciousness science took off in the late 1990s. It's going to make better ethics because we're going to be in a better position to identify what matters to animals, and also it can draw attention to the ethical implications. And so this leads us to the dimensions question, right? So just finally, in what ways are other systems conscious should be the question, both for science and for ethics, not the distribution question, and because of our answer to the methodological question. So how are other systems conscious? In what ways are they conscious? We can ask instead dimensions questions. Do animals feel physical sensations, right? Do garter snakes feel heat, for example? We can ask very specific questions about very specific species and the kinds of properties we're interested in. And this is the work that's being done right now. There's work developing, as Evan had mentioned, developing ideas of dimensions of consciousness that can be studied, dimensions of sentience, more specifically, sentience being this feeling, just feeling and perhaps feeling plus evaluation aspect of consciousness. Different philosophers have promoted different sets of properties that they think are really relevant to sentience. I think that these are missing something that's really important, and that is sentience related to relational properties. So what sorts of relationships do animals have? What are the contents of their cultures? Do they care if others conform to their cultural traditions? Do they have social norms? Do they feel shoulds and oughts, right? Do they feel like punishing or shunning individuals that aren't conforming to their behavior? the research I'm currently engaged in is about the deep importance of culture and sociality to other species. And this is not just chimpanzees, but it's also the fruit flies. That there's evidence of social learning and intergenerational transmission of behaviors, as I mentioned last night, when it comes to, say, preferring to have sex with the colored fruit fly that the other females around you are having sex with. So these relational questions are questions that I think are being missed in a lot of the conversations that are being had right now about animal sentience. And one of the things that we see in the evolution of life and the evolution of animal life is that there was always groups, there were always communities. The trilobites traveled together. It appears trilobites also had sexual selection, preferring other trilobites with like horny shoulder spikes. They traveled to a certain central locations together in order to reproduce at certain seasonal times. Sociality is the deep fact about animal life, and that's going to be an important part of our story of sentience. And so this turns me to the very end of discussing that there are policy implications, of course, with animal sentience. I completely agree with what Evan said in the Q&A after his talk about sentience being maybe overemphasized in ethics. I think it's a piece of ethics, but I'm not someone who thinks that it's the whole story at all, because interests go beyond positive and negative affect. But what we did in the New York Declaration is we decided to present to the larger scientific community and also to the general public what is this emerging consensus in consciousness studies. And that is that there's strong scientific support for attributions of conscious experience in mammals and birds. And the empirical evidence indicates at least a realistic possibility of conscious experience in all vertebrates, including reptiles, amphibians, and fish, and many invertebrates, including at least cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans and insects. And finally, that when there's a realistic possibility of conscious experience in an animal, it is irresponsible to ignore that possibility in decisions affecting that animal. So we should be considering welfare risks and use the evidence to inform our responses to these risks. For this reason, the dimensions and understanding what is of interest to animals, what different species actually care about, there's a real ethical mandate to do that sort of research. Yeah, with that, I'll just end and thank you for your attention and look forward to hearing from the rest of you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. That was really quite a wonderful talk. And I'm sure that we all got a lot out of it. But probably also because we're right now at 5 p.m., I think we had better break because we do want to have our meditation session at 5:30 that Molly Crockett's going to lead. So hopefully we will find another time to discuss, to take some of what you said and bring it into a discussion. I'm sure that many of these themes are going to continue to emerge this evening with Adam Frank, and then tomorrow morning with Richie Davidson and myself. Yes, Roshi? Roshi's giving me a peace sign. Richie's hand is up. I see. Oh, I don't see. Oh, there he is. Now he is there. Do we want to do that? Richie, you have 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll make it quick. First, I want to just express my deepest appreciation for your presentation and the implications of what you describe and your activism as a scientist or as a philosopher. It's really wonderful, welcome, and super important. I want to just put a question on the table. I will take it up to some extent tomorrow, but just to put it on the table, and that is when we use a word like conscious or consciousness, and we use it to characterize from processes from a C. elegans to a human, where we are in some sense implicitly assuming that since we're using the same word, we're referring to the same thing. And there's a very well-known paper that Jerome Kagan wrote many years ago in the American Psychologist called The Meaning of Personality Predicates. And I'll just give you one example from that. We often use the word fear, and we use it, for example, to characterize the state of a rodent as the rodent is anticipating receiving an electric shock. And we use the same word to characterize the state of a human as they're waiting to receive a diagnosis about whether they have a malignancy. And that is, I think, problematic. And it suggests that there's much more nuance here. And it really underscores that last theme that you described, which is in what ways are Molochs conscious? And I think that it's perhaps it would be helpful to get away from using the same word and figure out other ways of describing this that I think would be more faithful to the nuanced differences that are ultimately going to be important. I do want to say that I think the ethical implications that you're drawing out are powerful and critical. And for that reason, I can see the value of using the same word. But I also think that from a scientific perspective, it's complicated. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much for your comment. And this is definitely a topic I've thought deeply about as well, about what words to use when describing these features of the world. And there is reason to use the word consciousness because what it is an inclusive umbrella term that incorporates all of the diversity of ways of being conscious, from the kind of sentience feeling of being alive that Evan talked about, to the experiences of narrating to yourself what you're going to do next as you're building a bookcase or something, right? And everything else that goes on. And I'm not going to say everything in between because it's just it's an incredibly rich space. And so it's identifying a space. I agree with you about the need to identify dimensions, obviously. I think that is where the science needs to go. But I also think that in our kind of folk psychological language, when we use words like fear, we use them to describe things at a non-scientific level, on a personal level as well. And so there's value in keeping those folk psychological terms to use in a folk psychological context, and also identify terms that might be more precise, as long as we're not making that precision be species dependent. I think that we've been blinded by this social category of species too much, that we've been distracted by it too much. And we need to find more, other sorts of ways of grouping individual animals that I think will be richer. And one of those ways of grouping individual animals is in cultures, in multi-species cultures, right? So we can talk about like the culture of, say, my household, which includes humans and non-humans, or a culture of a zoo or a research lab that might include multiple species. So I'm hoping to move away both from species, centering the species, to centering other things. But yes, trying to be precise from in a scientific perspective, but also recognizing the importance of talking about continuity on a kind of personal level. I want my cake and I want to eat it too.
Yes, of course. Don't we all?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristen. I'm sure Evan has something to say, but we really do need to move on. So thanks very much, and we'll see you this evening. And practice is in the center at 5:30.